Thank you all for joining. My name is Maria Kastenfalk, and I'm sitting here with Gunnar Danielsson at the live Q&A session. As you already may know, he is the Senior Regulatory Advisor for Link Medical. Gunnar has traveled around the world performing GCP inspections for the Swedish Medical Product Agency for over 10 years. With over 40 years of experience in the medical industry, he has a wealth of experience from clinical trials in terms of quality management, electronic systems, data management, and clinical design and conduct. Gunnar today is a key advisory resource and helps companies meeting regulatory requirements. We have received a couple of questions, which we will answer shortly. But first, a few notices on how this will work. The meeting is being recorded. All the attendees are muted while Gunnar answers the questions. Because we have very few questions submitted in advance, Gunnar will answer those first. And if there is time, you can raise your hand or send in the question by the Q&A. If we don't have time to answer all the questions, we will send them the answers afterwards. So Gunnar, the floor is yours. The first question. For the last 18 months, virtual inspections and audits have become a norm due to the pandemic. Do you see this changing the way of performing GCP inspections permanently?
Thank you for the introduction. To answer the question, the answer is yes and no. When it comes to inspections that are being conducted at the clinical site, there is not going to be particularly much change compared to the past, because you still have the problem that the investigator site file is in paper format, and the confidentiality of the medical record requires you to be on site in the normal way that has always been. However, what has changed over the last couple of years is the inspections at the sponsor site. An EMA and the local agency has done quite a number of remote inspections. And I think that they found that this has been quite successfully. And therefore, it's quite likely that they will continue to do that one because of travel restrictions, but also time restrictions. It's quite time consuming to fly to California for 3 days inspection when you can do it at home and in your office. And so therefore, I think that we in the future is going to look for remote inspection. That might sound as a major change from the past, but actually it's not. Because when you think about it, quite often when the inspection has been done at sponsor site, there are still some certain areas and departments that are not present at the site, whether it be statistics, data management, pharmacovigilance. And so you're doing remotely inspections even when you're on site. So it's not going to be particularly much change on that one.
Thank you. Then we have another question. What are your 5 top recommendations on what to prepare for a SME that is notified of an upcoming inspection from EMA or National Competent Authority?
If you're being instructed that you're going to have an inspection, whether it be EMA or the local regulatory agencies, I think that the first thing you have to remember is to notify all people concerned. If they are looking for a clinical site, of course, you have to go to the investigator and making sure that the monitor and other people that are involved in the study are notified. But to do that one, I think that one of the important things when it comes to preparing for an inspection is to appoint 1 or 2 persons that takes the responsibility for the logistics and the preparations of all of these studies. And if you're having a sponsor inspections, you know pretty well what they're going to look for. The EMA traditional standard agenda highlights 10, 12 different processes, systems that they're going to look for during the inspections. And my suggestion would be to appoint 1 person per item and making sure that these people do a presentation of the items when it comes to their part in the inspections, because that will gives you the opportunity of explaining your processes and your systems to the inspectors without getting into nitty-gritty details and questions. And then finally, of course, what is very important is that you have to making sure that you have control of all your systems and documentation for that matter. You have to remember that at TMF, which is what the inspector is going to look for, it doesn't consist of one single file or system. It's usually a many system. It could be with the CRO, it could be with the drug supplies, it could be in the office, etc., etc. And at any times, you always have to be careful and making sure that you know where these ones are, because that's what the inspector is going to look for. But finally, and it's probably most important, is that if you do conduct a study according to laws and regulations, you are GCP compliant and you are inspection ready even before you start this one. That's very easily said, but much more complicated done. And everybody's trying to be inspection ready, but I'm afraid to say I still haven't seen anyone who is really 100% ready for an inspection.
Thank you. Then we have next question. How do you see compliance with GCP with the new normal as results of the pandemic, such as remote monitoring and decentralized studies?
It's obviously that over the last year and a half that the normal monitoring frequency and on-site visit hasn't been able to conduct in the normal way. But it's quite interesting to see that in the update of ICH GCP, which was 2016, the regulators were stressing the point of central monitoring. So even before the pandemic, they were asking you to change a little bit the way that you do monitor the study. Do not rely solely on site, but also doing central monitoring. And I think that if you really utilize the possibilities of doing central monitoring, i.e. looking at the data that's in the database, what has been submitted by the investigators, looking at the timing that takes to fill this in. You can identify any outlier, you can identify any changes between sites, and etc., etc. Well, gives you a very, very good possibility of making sure that you have adequate quality without actually having to go to the site in this place.
Okay. And then next question. Do you have any tip on how to perform a digital monitoring visit contact? And what documents are you allowed to request copies of for distance monitoring?
This is obviously a follow-up that is doing that one, that it is a feeling and an intention to do as much source data verification as possible. So how do you do source data verification where you can't actually go to the site and do that? And this is a very, very sensitive and a very complicated question to answer in a correct fashion, because you always have to making sure that you fulfill the criteria of confidentiality and secrecy and GDPR, etc., etc. Normally, when you request data from a site anonymously, of course, always taking away the name of the patients and putting it the study ID instead, you are looking for data that has been used in the clinical study. And it's been quite frequently used in the past by central ECG reading, central X-ray reading, etc., etc. So you have used the system quite frequently in the past. And in essence and in general, I think that you're allowed to request anonymized or pseudo-anonymized documentation of certain tests. What you are not allowed to do is to request a copy of the medical records. And the reason for that one is that the medical records usually contain information that is not a part of the clinical study protocol. It could be anything talking about family situation or psychological things that has nothing to do with that one. So to request a copy, anonymized or pseudo-anonymized, of a hospital record is clearly violating very strongly the way that you're doing that one. So you can't do that one. You can do it for individual tests or assessments, laboratory, etc., but not for medical records. Now the question is, can you do that anyway? Or doing source data verification in a remote setting? And the answer is quite interesting. When we started to do source data verification some 30, 40 years ago, the monitors were never allowed to look into the hospital records because they were confidential. So you were utilizing a system which we called cross-the-table reading, i.e. the monitor was sitting there with the CRF in front of him and asking the study staff who had the medical records in front of them and asking open questions, like, for example, did the patient report any adverse event between visit 2 or visit 6? And the study staff were then looking through the medical records and giving you the information. And this is a system that obviously was disappeared when we were getting access to the medical records, but maybe it's time to do that one because you can very easily do that remotely. And it's not uncommon to do that even today. And when this is something that has been used by the inspectors in many occasions when you're doing inspection in a country where you don't speak the language. And you can't even read the language. And I've used that system many times in China or in Israel or anywhere where the language is just totally impossible to read in my languages. So cross-table reading is something that can be used. It takes a little bit longer time than obviously, but at least you can do that without violating the secrecy and confidentiality of these ones. Because I think you have to remember, and it's extremely important, because I know that a lot of you wants to do source data verification. Can't you send me a copy of the medical records? And I'm just saying, no, you can't do that because it's a critical violation of the rights and the selfish of GDPR, the rights of the patient, etc., etc. So let's use other systems to ensure that we have the quality that we need in these circumstances.
Thank you. What is most important regarding sponsor oversight? How should this be documented?
Sponsor oversight is obviously something that the inspectors are looking very carefully on nowadays, to making sure that the sponsor is aware of what's going on. When it comes to the oversight of the clinical side, it's obviously the monitoring and the monitoring report that gives you the information of oversight that you need. And in this case, it's extremely important to making sure that you do the follow-up of any issues that have been identified by the monitor. When it comes to oversight of other players in these ones, I suppose that we're mainly thinking about the oversight of a delegated CRO. I think that we have to go back and say that the contract is the important part. You need a very detailed contract with the CRO or any other vendors about the responsibility, who's doing what, so you know exactly what am I going to do, what is the vendor going to do, to making sure that you have a line of communication. How are you going to communicate? By email, by meetings. If you're going to have meetings, specify how often you're going to have the meeting. Are you going to have telephone conferences once a week, once a month? And also, one of the things that is very often forgotten is to ensure that you have an escalation plan. What happens if there's a critical or a major finding that needs immediate attention? You don't wait for another weekly telephone conference by doing that one. So maybe you should have agreement in the contract that to do this once within 14 days, or not 14 days, as I said, but in 2 hours or something like that. So the contract is the critical part on these ones to establish a communication part of these ones. And of course, also in these ones, as I said, you have regular meetings, but also in the same thing that even if you delegated monitoring to a CRO, you have to make sure that you follow up on these monitoring, whether they follow the monitoring plan, whether they update any issues that's identified. And I also suggest that one of the things that have oversight of the monitoring activity is to do co-monitoring. It's not a requirement by regulatory purposes to doing co-monitoring, but it's just common sense to making sure that you keep control of what's going on in the study.
Okay. So you're saying you're going to have an emergency plan in the contract?
The answer is yes. This is something that contractors say. You need a documentation that agrees. There's an agreement between the vendor, the CRO, and the sponsor about what you're going to do if something happens.
Okay.
And it's one of the things that the inspector automatically go looking for: who's doing what, what's the communication, what's the escalation, and anything like that.
Thanks. Then the next question. Is there a requirement according to GCP to have a documented procedure SOP for contracts and agreements?
Well, that's a follow-up. As I just said, you need a contract.
Mm.
Do you need an SOP to have the contract? And the answer is no. It doesn't state it in that you need an SOP on these ones. What the regulations state is that if you delegate any items or tasks to an outside vendor, you need a written agreement. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that you have to have an SOP on how to do that. However, having said that, I would definitely recommend you to have a template of the agreement, just to making sure that you don't forget some of the important parts that you want to do. So you have all the communication plans and the escalation plans and meeting plan or whatever responsibilities. So it's structured in that way. Call it an SOP, call it a template, call it whatever you want it, but you need the written agreement.
Yeah. Thank you. What is your general view on expensive eTMF solutions? As a representative for a very small company with maximum 1 to 2 clinical trials yearly, what approach would you recommend? Do you consider it wise to spend large parts of the budget on expensive eTMF solutions? If yes, please elaborate on why this is a good idea. If no, what is your recommendation for a small company?
Well, it's of course important that you have a TMF, but there is nothing in the regulation that states that you need an electronic TMF. It's a documentation that is the important ones. If you're a small company, I can see no reasons why you should spend a lot of money to getting a sophisticated system for 1 or 2 trials, because you can't use the systems in a particularly efficient way. So why not use good old-fashioned papers? It's very nice. I like papers and so forth, so why not? And the eTMF is there, the electronic version of that one is there just to ensure that if you have many studies, that you can keep track of them in a very efficient way. But if you have a few studies, no, don't worry about that. Having said that, you have to remember that even if you use papers, which many still do, there's still going to be a considerable part of your documentation that is going to be electronic, whether you like it or not. But quite a lot of the communication, for example, is emails. And emails, of course, is a part of the trial master file, because that's communication part. So if you're using paper format or electronic for that matter, making sure that you put it into your official TMF in a timely fashion. Don't wait until the end of the study or anything like that. Or just put up a system and making sure that you keep track of all your documents and anything like that.
Okay. So do you have any recommendation? If you have about 1 or 2 clinical trials a year, you can use a paper TMF. When do you think they need to use an eTMF?
I have
5, 10 clinical trials? Or?
I have no idea. No, it's up to the organization and it's up to each individual company to decide that one. Because once again, the regulation doesn't state anything about system. The same applies with follow-up and then the originals and then documentation. So whether it be papers or electronic doesn't really matter.
Okay.
You use electronic when it's suitable, and you use paper when it's suitable.
Okay.
It's as simple as that. And many companies use a hybrid of these ones. They usually have contracts or partly of these ones in paper format, and others have all electronics and so forth. So there are different varieties.
Okay.
And it's up to the individual company to decide.
Okay.
But don't, once again, to answer the question, as I said, for a small company, it's unnecessary to embark on a major expense just for 1 or 2 studies, or 5 studies, or 7.
Or 10.
You never know.
Thank you. The next question is, if a document is signed electronically in some different e-systems and will be transferred to eTMF as a PDF, should the original signature systems and date be verified? If yes, how and what should be verified? What kind of documentation is sufficient to demonstrate that e-signature is valid and that this could replace original wet ink signing?
That's actually 2 questions. First of all, as I said, what electronic systems or electronic signature do you accept? And when you think about it, we've used electronic signatures within clinical research for the last 20 years, i.e. the investigator signing off the CRF electronically. That's been a traditional way of doing it for many, many years. So the same applies for everything else, is that it needs to be password protected. Whether you use DocuSign or Visma or any other systems, I have no idea. So you can use any of them. As long as you can identify what system has been used and who did the signature based on the password.
Okay.
So it's password protected. The other question is that how do you do when you transfer a document from one system to another? This is quite a complicated question, because in many cases you do quite often transfer. You keep a document in one system. The CRO might be having their system. Drug supplies will have their systems. Pharmacovigilance will have their system. And when do you transfer them into the official TMF? If you do transfer them. You don't necessarily have to transfer them, but if you do. So I think that what is the inspectors are looking for many times is the accuracy of the trial master file and the timely update of these ones. To making sure that, okay, you have a contract and an agreement, the investigator sign it, you have it in one system. Transfer it immediately to these ones. So you have the audit trail or anything like that. If you keep a document in another system, like a CRO system, when you transfer that one, you have to remember that there must be a one-to-one connections between the 2 systems. So when you transfer it, you also have to transfer the audit trail and anything like that, which is very often forgotten. So you just get a document that is being updated into the archive TMF system 6 months after it's been created. So how do I know that it's been created for 6 months if there's no audit trail and there's no metadata that go with it? So my suggestion would always be, as I said, that try to transfer data as quickly as possible into your TMF system, whether paper or electronically, doesn't matter, to making sure that you have an updated, timely version of your archiving system, because that will take away all the problem. Then you have a lot of documents that maybe not necessarily has to be transferred, because it's quite okay. Data management keep their documentation. biostatistics keep their documentation, and pharmacovigilance keep their documentation, etc., etc. That's quite all right. The average number of electronic systems in a normal clinical sponsor, I believe, is around 13 to 15. And there's no problem with that. But at any given time, you have to know where is the data and where is the one that I can regard as the correct data and not the one, because otherwise we start getting half copies here and half copies there. And in the end, nobody has the slightest idea. And one of the things that we already mentioned is emails, because they cause an enormous problem. Because you usually keep them on your server, which does not fulfill the regulatory requirement with audit trail or anything like that. You keep them in SharePoint or whatever system you're using, which has an audit trail of 3 months and then it disappears. So if you're using emails, making sure that you have a robust system that allows transfer of the data from that system to your TMF when that day comes. Or store it in that robust system if it fulfills the regulatory requirement.
From the beginning.
From the beginning.
Thanks. I think we have talked about this already, but it is a question. In a situation where the patient doesn't understand local language, how do you ensure adequate information and informed consent?
It's obviously a complicated question, and the way that the society is today, there's quite a lot of number of people that do not speak the local language. And how do you ensure that they get the correct informed consent, the correct information? And in normal medical research, you do that with a translator, by family members, or anyone, but making sure that the patient is receiving the correct information for medical care. And the same applies for clinical research. You cannot anticipate what language a patient is going to speak when you start a clinical trial. Obviously, you can't enter a patient that doesn't speak whatever Swedish or Norwegian or any other language, local language, if part of the study includes quality of life questionnaires that requires knowledge of the language. But if you're saying, for example, an oncology study where the main parameter is tumor size, it doesn't really matter if they can speak the language or not, apart from the integrity and the safety of the patient, of course. But that can it be handled in a normal clinical setting? Why can't it be ensured in the same way in a clinical research? If you expect a lot of non-speaking Swedish or local languages speaking people, it would be good to make an assessment of the implication of that in the application to the ethics committee, to making sure that they are aware that there is going to be a lot of studies, which is not uncommon, believe it or not, because we do have a lot of orphan drug studies where the patient comes from all over the world, because there might be one site in the whole world that is treating that sort of indication. You can't really have translation of patient information or in consent to all of these languages. So you have to making sure that in the end, it is a responsibility of the investigator to satisfy for himself that the patient has received the information, understood the information, and is giving his voluntary approval to participate in the clinical study.
Now we have another question. How to handle delegation to a radiologist performing RECIST assessment if done at the radiology department or done at a private radiology clinic? Many pharmaceutical companies ask for a delegation to be given by the PI, but the site has an agreement with the imaging department to perform the imaging and assessments. and do not want to use any delegation sheet signed by the PI?
Delegation and the delegation log and the delegation list has been a concern for the last 25 years. And every company is doing it slightly differently. What
Is there a right way to do it?
Of course, my way. No, it's if you look at the regulation, it's stated that the investigator should keep a list of patients that is delegated significant trial-related duties. It's also saying that if it's delegated to another other department, that he should ensure that they are qualified to do it. And to ensure that one, you usually do an agreement. So you do an agreement. I mean, in this case, you're talking about if the investigator has an agreement with the Department of Radiology, all the documentation is there. You don't need a delegation log. And in principle also, you can't really delegate to somebody that's outside your responsibility. You can only delegate to staff that reports to you. But this I don't know how to put it, but I said I've seen over the years some companies, they are very, very keen on having every single person that you can think of on the delegation log. And that includes pharmacy, laboratory, X-ray departments, or anything like that. It doesn't matter, and then you don't need to do that one because you have information anyway. If they are doing a very important part of the study, you would like to have a written agreement.
Okay.
And pharmacy, you have a written agreement. In Sweden, it's very easy because you have landstingsavtal with the different departments that is involved in these ones. You have an agreement with pharmacy. So why would you put them on the delegation log? Because you've already agreed them.
Okay, and then I have another question, and that's also about the delegation log. Even if the person is doing the normal job, do they have to be on the delegation log?
The answer is no. It's once again, the regulation clearly states significant trial-related duties. And that means that in my mind, you're talking about the study coordinator, sub-investigator that is taking responsibility for safety and efficacy. But if you have a nurse taking a blood sample or you have a nurse taking blood pressure, you don't have to put them on the log. They are documented in the hospital records anyway, who's done it. So you know who's done it and that they're qualified to do it. But they don't have to be in the delegation log because that just causes problem because then you need to have GCP training, you need to have an updated CV, blah, 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 and it just causes havoc. Okay. So keep the number of people on to significant trial-related duties.
Okay. We have some more questions, and we have 3 questions coming in the Q&A. So we can start with this one. Do you always need to collect new informed consent when the patient information is updated during an ongoing study?
The answer is no. Once again, the regulation very clearly states that you should only ask for a new informed consent or an updated informed consent if it contains new information that might affect the patient's interest of participating in the study. But very often, as I said, the updated informed consent may be changed that you add another country or you're taking a blood sample or anything like that. It's not going to affect the interest of the patient to participate in the study. I've seen so many things that updating these ones that just making life a little bit complicated. So the answer is no.
Okay. Now we have a question from the audience. Have you found more errors in companies that only use paper TMF?
Yeah, I would say the other way around. The ones who are using electronic TMF usually find themselves in much more trouble because then you have an electronic system that needs requirements, documents, and user testing, validation, updating, and God knows what you have to do to making sure that you have these ones. paper TFF is a paper, and it's very easy to find these ones. But so the answer is no, it's probably the other way around. Everybody's going electronic. I know we're going electronically, and it's a future in the long run. But you have to remember that it doesn't come easy, because it is getting more and more complicated with electronic systems. And it's also to remember that the regulatory agencies are getting more and more concerned about the electronic system. And that is, of course, specifically when it comes to EDC and data handling. Because obviously the collection and the handling and the analysis and the reporting of the data is critical. But any system that is requiring these ones, you have to make sure that you have all the documentation, audit trails and anything like that. So, and the inspectors, I know that Denmark, for example, has appointed one inspector for the GSP unit who's an IT expert. He doesn't know anything about GCP, but he's an IT expert. So he will just look at the validity of the systems and anything like that. So be prepared. Use paper, it's easier.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. At what stage in the development process from idea to completed product do you expect to see GXP fully implemented?
Oh.
That's a good question. Do you have any good answer?
I can always give an answer. No, you obviously, depending on what GXP you're talking about, before you can go into man, even before, you have to be able to manufacture the drug. And that, of course, has to be according to GMP. You have to do animal studies, has to be according to GLP. You have to distribute the drug according to GDP. And when you start giving the first application for a clinical trial, you have to follow GCP. So it's going to be it's not that you say that from today on, I'm going to follow GXP. You have to do it in different steps depending on what GXP you're talking about. But it's always easier in the long run to follow the regulation from day zero rather than trying to implement it halfway through a system, because that just causes havoc and just makes life a little bit easier to making sure that you have all these ones.
Okay. Another question. From which time point should documentation from a clinic site consider being part of a study and be included in the TMF? Do you always need to document from site ID and or pre-study visits if the site is not included selected for participation? Where is the limit drawn? Is it when the site is submitted for approval to the ECMPA?
Once again, one of these questions where it's going to vary from sponsor to sponsor. The TMF is there to verify the conduct of the study. So why would you keep in the TMF information of somebody that doesn't participate in the study? There's no requirement to do that one from a regulatory purposes, of course. Unless, depending on where they don't start. If you submitted maybe an application, it will be there because you usually submit for many sites at the same time. If you submitted or given them drugs, you definitely have to do drug accountability just because you've done that one. But otherwise, if you're looking for screening a site for participation and then you realize, no, they're not going to be bothered, that's an internal document that doesn't belong in the TMF. It might be important for a CRO to prove to the sponsor that you've actually done your job and you want to making sure that you're getting paid for it or anything like that. But that's something completely different. As a TMF, it's a site that is being opened up and is being participating in the study for the conduct of the study.
Okay. I think we have more questions from the audience. Now I see. If you have a study ongoing at the site where you use the pathology department, who would have to sign the delegation log, the PI or the head of the pathology department?
None of them. You have an agreement between the institution that is conducting the clinical trial and the Department of Pathology. In a normal hospital, that is automatic. You have an agreement. You just have the investigator just have to ensure that the pathology knows what it's actually going to look for in that specific study. And they would normally report it in a normal pathology report, where they sign off whatever they find. You don't need any delegation because you can't delegate to another department. You make an agreement, but you can't delegate. And it's an internal issue at the Department of Pathology if they want to delegate and have a delegation list of who's, how should I say, is qualified to do the assessment or not. So if they want to have the technician to sign off the report, then the head of the department has to verify that that person is qualified to do that one and has the right to sign it off. But if it's a pathologist, he is qualified by training and education and by being appointed by the hospital by itself. So keep them as few as possible and make life easy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gunnar, for attending this. The time's running up. Thank you all for attending this Q&A session with Link Medical. We will send out a follow-up email, and if you have more questions, send them to Claudia or to me, and we will try to answer them as soon as possible. So thank you, everyone, for joining this Q&A session.
Thank you.